Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very empowering show coming right up with special guests, Maika and Maritza Moulite, and they're here to share with us their new novel, One of the Good Ones. So isn't being human enough? When a teen social activist and history buff is killed under mysterious circumstances after attending a social justice rally, her devastated sister and their family are left reeling in the aftermath. Maika is a Miami native and the daughter of Haitian immigrants. She earned her bachelor's degree in marketing from Florida State University and an MBA from the University of Miami. She's sharpened her skills as a PhD student at Howard University's Communication, Culture, and Media Study program. Her research focuses on representation in the media and its impact on marginalized groups. Her sister Maika graduated from the University of Florida with a bachelor's in women's study and the University of Southern California with a master's in journalism. She's worked in various capacities for NBC News, CNN, USA Today, and many more. Maritza is a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, exploring ways to improve literacy in under-resourced communities. So let's welcome to the show, Maika and Maritza Moulite.
Thank you for having us.
What an honor it is to have the both of you here. Oh my goodness, I loved this book. I have to ask you, what inspired you to write it?
Yes. So essentially when it was a few years ago now, and we were attending the funeral for our great aunt, and she was an older woman and she passed away from, medical complications. And as we were walking through the cemetery, we were looking at the names of people who had already passed on. And one of the names that we came across was Trayvon Martin's name. And we're both from Miami, Florida. And when we saw his name in that moment, it felt very, real. I think sometimes when things happen in the national eye, folks tend to forget that these are real people who have family members and other things, So as we were going through our own grieving process and we saw, his name there, it just really stuck with us. And we knew that we wanted to write a story Maritza, you might have to mute yourself. Sorry. But we knew that we wanted to tackle a story. We wanted to have a story that tackles racial injustice in America by looking at it through the lens of one family in particular, but even more specifically through the lens of sisterhood. And so that's essentially what was our guiding light when we set out to write One of the Good Ones, because we wanted to get a little bit into allyship and the ways in which people might use phrases like one of the good ones, thinking that it's helpful when it actually is harmful.
So let's talk about the two sisters. So what, I know you guys are, you're two sisters, you're writing about two sisters. Were you guys taking information from your own lives or just your experiences for these two characters?
Hi, Maritza here. So we would say that on most days, the good days, Maika and I and our two younger sisters are the closest and the best of friends, and don't really have as much as what you find between Happi and Kezi and Jenny in One of the Good Ones. But we 100% pulled from real world experiences of the everyday side of having a sister, like arguing and yelling about who gets to be in the bathroom. And honestly, even when you do have as close of a relationship as we do amongst ourselves, like our four pod, it is still very common to have those moments where you feel like no one understands you, that you're the odd one out of your sisters and everyone else has something going on and you don't. That feeling of having the sense that you don't belong, that you're not really a part of the group, is something that we can all identify with in one moment or another in our lives. And we wanted to explore that with our sisters, Happi, Jenny, and Kezi.
You can really, I think anyone who has a sister can identify with that. And that's why this book is such a great young adult book, because you have young people in many different aspects identifying with Kezi and Happi throughout this book. I would love for the two of you to share just a little bit about what this book is about. We don't want to go into spoilers because we don't do that here.
Yes.
Everyone wants to get their own copy of one of the good ones. But, I feel like regardless of what your age, I feel like it's a really profound book to read.
Yeah. So one of the good ones is about 17 turned 18-year-old Kezi Smith. She is a budding social activist. She has a large YouTube following, and she decides to take her digital activism offline and attend her first protest. And while she's there, she ends up getting arrested or detained, and she ends up dying under mysterious circumstances. So her sisters, Happi and Jenny, are reeling in the aftermath of her death, and they decide to embark on a journey using Kezi's copy of the Negro Motorist Green Book as their guide. Because in addition to Kezi being an activist and having this really big YouTube platform, she is also a huge history buff. So Jenny and Happi and Kezi's girlfriend Jimena and her best friend Derek end up going on a journey using this Negro Motorist Green Book as their guide. And really, it's a tale about the family members who are left behind in the midst of a very, very public tragedy. And it's also about allyship, and in the ways that, like I mentioned earlier, folks might consider only certain types of Black people one of the good ones and others not so much, and how that type of thinking is actually harmful to everybody. And finally, it's looking at sisterhood and the ways in which legacy is, especially a legacy of racial trauma, is passed on in this country, and the way that it manifests in the relationships of these sisters.
So Maritza, when you were doing the research, both of you were doing the research for it, I mean, you talk about this guide. A lot of people don't know about this. I'd love for you to expand a little bit on what this is.
So the Negro Motorist Green Book is essentially a yellow pages of sorts for Black people to use that was published from 1936 to 1966. It was created by a postal service worker, Victor Hugo Green, who honestly got sick and tired of being sick and tired and not knowing where he would be welcomed or safe when he was traveling across the family or friends. So he decided to use his role, having access to all of these different locations, to make a list of restaurants and rest homes and tourist houses and hotels and motels and gas stations that would be welcoming of Black people, so that there would be at least one less thing for you to worry about when you were on the road. On the one hand, it's great to have access to your own car. You're in your personal space and you don't have to go to the back of a bus or to a certain car on a train. You have that autonomy and agency, but it still was very difficult to travel as a Black person, as sometimes it is as you're traveling and going to certain places around the country today. And I had never heard about the Negro Motorist Green Book in school, Maika neither. And she had learned about it a few years earlier than I did. And we decided when we were writing one of the good ones that we definitely wanted to use the Green Book as an anchor of sorts for our story. Because if you're going to talk about issues of race and prejudice, especially in the United States, you have to put it in the context of the past to understand what is going on today. So our characters have ancestors who used the Green Book in their own travels in the past to get to where eventually we find our characters in the present.
I mean, there's just so much that they never share. I never knew about that either. And there's so much they never share in history class. So you never hear about any of this. And also one of the things that you share in the book as well and discuss are Sundown Towns. And I'd love for you to share about that as well.
Yes. So when we were going through the research process for one of the good ones, we came across so many things that we didn't know, like Maritza mentioned, and learning about Sundown Towns was one of them. So Sundown Towns, if you hear the name, you might have an inkling of what it means or what it is, but they are essentially towns in which Black people had to leave before the sun went down, or you might face great harm. And it's really interesting to think, and it's not surprising that something like this would exist, and it's across the entire nation. It's not concentrated only in the South, and it was important for us to highlight that because very often people like to have conversations about race and make it seem like, oh, well, the South is really where it's bad. It's like, actually, no, it's around the country. And we made a point of having our characters come from LA, which folks would consider, California, one of the most liberal states in this country. But there are still issues of, racial prejudice that occur there. And as they're embarking on this journey, starting in Chicago, going across the country to LA, we have them stop in places, whether it's Oklahoma or Arizona, even though it's a little bit out of the way, and different places of that nature. We still have locations that we made up, that we wanted to really drive home the point that this could happen in anywhere USA. But sundown towns are really interesting in the sense that Black people could work in those areas depending on the types of work they might be able to find. But even if you were working there, you still had to leave before the sun went down. And if you happen to find yourself there, like some of our characters in one of the good ones, then great harm, could happen. And it's interesting to think how these towns haven't gone away. They're still here. And Maritza and I did the little mini series podcast talking about the Negro Motorist Green Book, and we talk about sundown towns and how when we talk about this this summer of racial reckoning, as it's been coined, about the summer of 2020, there were many of those places that were sundown towns where many of the Black Lives Matter protests of last year were occurring. So they still exist, and maybe not in the same instances of people having to leave once the sun goes down, but understanding that history is still very much alive in these areas.
That's just astounding to me that those things exist today. I mean, sometimes it feels like we're farther ahead than we are, and then things happen. And it's like we're not. We're still have a lot to deal with as a culture and as a people. When you were doing your research for this book, was there anything that surprised you?
Ooh, fun question. Okay, so when we were doing research about one of the good ones, we came across several different cool tidbits about Black history that we had, again, never learned about in school or come across in pop culture or the media in some way. So one example is that we learned about the 761st Tank Battalion, also known as the Black Panthers. They were the Black Panthers before Wakanda existed. But essentially, they were an all African American unit in the Army. Up until after World War II, the military was still segregated. So this all Black unit was kind of stowed away and just stuck training for several years because the leaders in the Army didn't know what to do with them. And white soldiers with much less experience would be shipped off earlier. Finally, the Black Panthers did have the opportunity to go fight for and represent their country abroad, and were important members of battles like the Battle of the Bulge. I believe they were at Normandy Beach. Several of the members ended up with Purple Hearts, and someone had a Medal of Honor. And it was just such an interesting part of Black history, of American history, because Black history is American history, that I had never learned about, which I found very fascinating.
Yeah, that is just, I mean, to find these hidden nuggets of history, I think, good and bad and just, we need to uncover this because a lot of people are growing up never knowing that any of this existed. And I think that's probably where that disconnect comes with, what's happening today.
Yeah, I mean, it's you don't know what you don't know. And there's that adage that if you don't know where you've been, you won't know where you're headed. And Maritza and I are both, in addition to being authors, we're both currently PhD students. I'm a PhD student at Howard University, and Maritza is a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania. And right now in my studies, we're looking at really the history of, Black media in the United States and the coverage of different things that have happened in society. And what's really interesting to me is how so many of the conversations that folks were having in the 1800s, that in the early 1900s, down through 1999 to currently today, these are conversations that have been going on for centuries. And it can be a little bit discouraging when you see how we're forced to kind of relive history over and over, and we're failing this open book test, even though we know we've already had these conversations, right? But it was also important for us throughout one of the good ones to make sure that we are incorporating not just the tragedies that happen to Black people. We have moments of joy that are interspersed throughout. Maritza mentioned the 761st Tank Battalion, and we also learned about Stagecoach Mary, also known as Mary Fields was her name. And I just found out about this woman. I was like, this is so fascinating. Like, we need to figure out a way to incorporate her into the story. And really, Stagecoach Mary essentially was this Black woman. She became the first Black woman to have a postal carrier role, if you will. And her job was to protect the stagecoaches that carried the mail across the United States from being attacked, so people wouldn't steal the mail. And she originally was working at this convent as somebody who was like a groundskeeper, but she ended up getting into, as the story goes, getting into a disagreement with a janitor, and they pulled their guns out on each other. So she was she's described as she drank alcohol, she had 2 guns, she cursed, she wore men's clothing, she was totally a badass. And
oh my gosh, yeah.
It was just really interesting to learn about her. So as we're learning about the history that we aren't taught in schools, we wanted to make sure that we highlighted some really cool things too, like Black cowboys and how, during their peak, 1 in 4 cowboys were Black, and other interesting tidbits, and as well as the characters going through history, because it's not, we don't want to position it as everything about being Black is pain and tragedy and turmoil. It absolutely has those instances, but there's so much more to that. And we want folks to read one of the good ones and to consider all of the ways in which, we're just people. We're just trying to make it out and live this life that we're all each destined to live. But yeah, so it's, focusing on the history that we aren't taught, but trying to inject some of the different aspects about Black identity as well.
Yeah, I think it really helps, especially with this being a young adult book. It really helps educate so many young people so we can start having these discussions, and it really kind of opens things up, I think, to hopefully we pass the open book test someday, right?
That's the hope and the goal, even though we are artists who are inspired by these interesting pieces of history that we have learned, and we can turn them into different things in our own stories. We hope that people read our words and just get their interest piqued, enough to the point where they go off and do more of that additional research on their own, just to learn something new and see things from a slightly different perspective than what they grew up with, and just in general, especially after the summer of racial reckoning that some people have been calling what happened over these past few months. Honestly, so many people have been having these conversations about racial injustice in this country for so long. But for the first time, more people who perhaps, who definitely weren't paying attention before, did start paying attention. And you saw so many books that were talking about racism, anti-racism, were on bestsellers list, and there are so many conversations happening. And that is honestly just a preliminary step. You have to do more than just buy the book. You have to open the book and read it, and you have to apply the things that you're learning in it into your own life. You have to honestly look within yourself and see what you can improve on as an ally. You can reach out to people who might be experiencing some of the things that you're reading about in the stories, so that you have a bigger world, more than what we're all just used to. And I think that is something that we can all do better at.
It's just interesting how I think your book is bringing such dialogue to this. It's really bringing this topic up. And I think, with all the other books that you mentioned, I think there's just this thirst and hunger to really understand what is what's going on right now, so people can start making changes and really looking at life and how we treat one another in a completely different way. I would, and just kind of to pivot from here, I would love for the two of you to share how your writing process is. I heard about this and I am completely intrigued with how you wrote this book.
Yes. So Maritza and I have two different writing styles. I'm what, in the literary streets, they like to call a pantser, which means I write by the seat of my pants. And Maritza is a plotter, which means she's super boring and lists everything out before an outline. So in order for us to be able to work together, I have had to adopt the plotter life. I very begrudgingly have done so, but it has been to the benefit of our story. So what we do is that we have a really extensive outline that we create before we even get started. And we'll start off with the 5-act story structure first and kind of plot everything along those lines. Like, what is the inciting incident? What's rising? What happens to the climax? What's the resolution and all of that? And so we go through each of those processes and then we flesh it out even more. So our outlines can be anywhere from like 10 to 15, 20 pages long. And then when it comes time to write, this is, I guess, where the pantsing comes in. We just write. We decide, I want to write this scene. You could write the next. We might write a full chapter. The next person might write the next. We haven't split our writing along character lines yet, which is something that everybody asks us. Like, did this person write this character and the other person wrote this character? And no, we both write everything. It's honestly hasn't occurred to us that we could do it this way, maybe for the third book, but honestly, probably not, because this way has been working for us. And we just make sure that we go back and reread what the other person has written and kind of comb through it, make any edits, inject our own sensibilities so that by the time the reader gets to it, it seems as if it's only one person who's written the book. And I would say we've gotten pretty good at it. There's in particular, there's a part from Dear Haiti Level Lane that I know that I wrote, but Maritza insists that she wrote. So yeah, that's a little bit what our writing process is like. Us interjecting.
Well, and Maritza, I know, I heard her say that, the planning can be a little boring. I'm sure you have some thoughts on that, right?
I would argue that the planning is the best part. No, honestly, I would say that I think the best part is after you have a draft and then you can really work on it and you have things to move around and take away and just shape into something. But that planning process to get there is so enjoyable. And even though we do have very similar sensibilities, we don't actually share a brain. So we just have no choice. And I'm so happy that my way is the best way for us.
Well, however you guys did it, it's magic. I love this book. I think it's actually appropriate for all ages. And even though it's really for young adults, I think people of all ages can read this book and really learn something and really enjoy the book as well. Where can our listeners connect with you and be part of your community and learn more about your work?
Yes, you can follow us online. We're at Maika Moulite and at Maritza Moulite everywhere. And you can also visit our website, which is maikaandmaritza.com. And if you're interested in checking out one of the good ones, we have a special landing page thanks to our publisher, Inkyard Press, through HarperCollins, which is oneofthegoodonesbook.com.
Well, Maika and Maritza, thank you both so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having us. This was awesome.
Well, thank you. It has been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, One of the Good Ones. Again, if you'd like to connect with Maika and Maritza, you can at oneofthegoodonesbook.com for more information. The book's available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all indie retailers. And if you don't see it on the shelf, ask for them to order it. And of course, you can purchase this on Kindle. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You're listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary. A recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Sunday, Monday, Thursday, and Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern and 5 p.m. Pacific Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.